Hello, welcome back. Welcome to our third session, which is on ethics, fairness, and justice. Um, the original plan was to have three speakers in this session, but our third speaker, Seper Vakil, couldn't be here, so we'll have extra time for questions at the end. Our first speaker in this session is Ezekiel Dixon-Román. He is currently professor of critical race, media, and educational studies at Teachers College at Columbia, where he's been since January of 2023. He's also director of the Edmund W. Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education. Ezekiel situates his discussion of AI within a larger theoretical and historical nexus. He describes his work as being about technology of quantification, which include the AI-related technologies that are focused on our symposium today, as well as older technologies such as psychometrics. Dr. Dixon-Román is also the author of the book Inheriting Possibility, Social Reproduction, and Quantification in Education.
Okay. Good afternoon. And thank you, Bruce, for the gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to be back in Evanston at Northwestern, the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. I spent 2 years here as an IES postdoc with Larry Hedges in IPR almost 20 years ago, in 2006 or 2008, as we were just talking about. And I have to say, wow, time really flies. Let me begin by situating myself, as I recognize we are in multidisciplinary company. I did my formal training in the social sciences and psychometrics. I've worked as a statistical programmer, have employed and taught methods from applied validity modeling and structural equation modeling all the way to item response theory, growth, and dynamic modeling. I studied psychometrics because I was interested in developing ways of using quantitative methods to model processes of power, marginalization, and racialization. In parallel to my study of psychometrics and quantitative methods, I was also studying and interested in critical and cultural theory, and began to find my language and home there. In fact, it was because of the seeming incommensurabilities between critical theory and quantification that brought me to making the technologies and practices of quantification my object of study. Thus, my work focuses on the critical and cultural theorizing of the ways in which power and logics of raciality become part of the machine, the ways in which the machine becomes a racializing force, and how we might be able to rethink and rework technology for alternative possibilities. What I will share today follows these lines of inquiry. I am very much so looking forward to our dialogue today, as I will try to lay out in my 40 minutes how the urgency and the stakes of this conversation have become exponentiated in the past few months. There are several provocative questions this panel seeks to tackle. I will try to touch on each, but what I really want to spend some time on are the following two questions. What are the big tensions, challenges, and limitations in this space? And what are some challenges in enacting this vision of fairness and justice in AI? What I would like to share today are some notes, even italicized notes, on the potential implications of the ongoing political discourse, what I will later characterize as a form of libertarian anarcho-capitalism, or even a libertarian anarcho-capitalist desire, for the discourses and concerns for ethics, equity, and justice in AI in particular. These are notes on the volatility of the political condition, thus disjunctured by the instability of the prevailing and unfolding political order, or we might say disorder. What I will unpack later is an unquestionable attack on the Enlightenment ideals of liberalism, both by way of liberal political philosophy and the liberal institutions of higher education and civil society. While some of us have been engaging in deconstructive and critical interventions on liberalism, aesthetic philosophy, and its bedfellow of colonialism, and the global project of the racial. In this moment, I can appreciate Theodor Adorno's and Max Horkheimer's lament of the Enlightenment's undelivered promise of reason. Not because I believe in liberalism and the promise of reason, as both were fraught with racial politics, but because in this moment it feels as though we are slipping into, or maybe back into, a new era of the Dark Ages. Yet, a number of us have also argued that there is no possibility for progressive movements and racial justice unless the existing system of racial capitalism and colonial worlding were imploded. I will try to lay out how the ongoing dismantling of the liberal institutions of the state and civil society may present a moment or condition for the opportunity to reshape the imagined and desired futures. And I will posit and explain how AI will play a pivotal role in shaping any anticipated futurity and the ways in which this will be / already is the site of contestation. I'll begin by discussing my reading of the discourse on fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics / equity, aka FATE, in AI prior to and after COVID. I posit COVID as a conjunctural event that marked a significant shift in this discourse and the development of AI. I then will speak to the conjuncture of COVID and what was conditioned then to anticipate the accelerationist agenda of this moment. I will then discuss the Trump / Musk political discourse in desiring machine. Here, I will begin by speaking to the role of technology and the play of time and the speed of life, and why this matters for equity and justice in AI, including an engagement with this question of, what do they want? And I even have bracketed here, fucking want. Finally, in fact, I felt like I had license after thank you. Finally, I will provide some provocations on why this matters for AI educational technologies, what becomes of AI ethics and equity, and what needs to be done. Scholarship on ethics and bias in AI has predominantly focused on concerns of transparency, politics of representation, moral ethical norms, and refusal. These interventions have often led to solutions that seek to co-opt or redesign in terms of repurposing technology, including the repurposing of technology as a means of resistance. The problem of transparency has been highlighted by scholars and activists that see a correlation between the biases of technological systems, for instance, in search engines, and the way the system is designed to reproduce them. For this reason, they argue the system must be redesigned so that it is possible to reveal the discriminatory practices that it reproduces, and at the same time, to repair or correct these practices by reinserting in the system what has been excluded. Transparency thus becomes an issue of designing the structural representation of the system to make the black box of AI accountable for its discrimination, but also to push a political retooling of machines towards a correct, equal, and democratic representation. Like transparency, the politics of representation have become common sense in the discourse on ethics in AI. Here, the concern has been, among others, on questions of representation among the data scientists in the training data and outcomes among the contributors to the design and development of technosocial or technopolitical systems, and whether the voice of community members are included. Iterations of this can be found in the participatory AI approaches and attempts to design systems of AI through a more democratic process that incorporates the voice of the communities the technology will be used with, including the voices of the marginalized. The argument is that if there was greater representation by way of race, gender, class, abilities, and so on, then the developed systems would be able to process differences better and be fairer and more equitable in their outcomes. Ethics in AI has also reinvigorated philosophical and legal literature on ethics, especially influencing the work of computer and data scientists. These lines of inquiry have engaged different ethical paradigms in relation to various types of decision-making events. Some of this literature has appropriately argued that in any decision-making event, various ethical paradigms can be applied, each of which are competing with one another, thus demonstrating the need to develop frameworks of ethical practices for any particular decision-making event. Others have sought to design and introduce social norms into the decision-making technology. This includes training an algorithm on social norms that function as an adjudicator to the decision-making algorithms. This approach relies not on programmed logic or reasoning, but on coded norms of acceptable representation. Thus, whenever the decision-making algorithm begins to misbehave beyond the coded norms, the adjudicating algorithm will check the decision-making algorithm, in effect surveilling and policing the behavior of the decision-making algorithm. These algorithmic approaches seek to apply moral ethical norms grounded in discourses of representation to the decision-making process of data science. Although I agree that there is a problem with the universal model of technology, it goes far beyond representation. Representation, I argue, always contains a haunting, that which is not fully represented, an excess, and as sociologist and cultural theorist Patricia Clough puts it, a non-static shift in the represented. That is to say, there is always a disjuncture or a disjointedness in the referent, the represented, through the entanglement of time, space, and matter. The sign, i.e., for instance, data, can never fully represent the signified or the referent. Both the represented and the referents always contain that which is overflowing, irreducible, and indeterminate. Representation rests on post-Enlightenment dualisms of signifier/signified, exteriority/interiority, exclusion/inclusion, the body/mind, and the world/transcendental reason. These are all dualisms that have not only received adequate deconstructive attention on the ways in which their seemingly irreducible differences are mutually constitutive, but also, and maybe more importantly, these same dualisms were aligned with and tied to racial logics, where the signifier, exteriority, exclusion, the body, and the world were all tied to the object of the non-European other, and where the signified, interiority, inclusion, the mind, and transcendental reason were associated with the subject of Europe. Thus, inasmuch as we fall back into the discourse of representation for answers or relief of concerns for ethics, equity, justice, and AI, is inasmuch as we will continue to be trapped, even haunted by the colonial logics of racialism of modern thought through the machine. While representation does have its importance, the question I'm wrestling with is this: if all we need are better representations, then I must ask, why does racial violence and subjugation persist? For example, the 5 police officers that killed Tyree Nichols. Put differently, if representation and training data scientists, or designers is what's needed, then why does algorithm bias continue even when these forms of representations are met? I argue that the challenge of equity and justice in AI is not just about ethics, but is an ethical, political, and onto-epistemological problem. In other words, the problem is not simply about moral principles or the right coordinates of identity markers, but inseparably entails the contours and instrumentalizing of power, process of becoming, and epistemological processing of information that reproduces ontological being. I want to begin this next section, as I mentioned, these are notes, so they're disjunctured, if you will. But I want to begin this next section with a quote. The time is out of joint. I am intrigued, maybe even obsessed with haunting, with ghosts, with specters, chasing them, conjuring them, and enabling them to speak. This quote from Shakespeare that French philosopher Jacques Derrida plays on in Spectres of Marx is a deconstructive reference to the ways in which time is not linear nor smooth, but rather disjointed, disjunctured, disadjusted, disharmonic, in discord, unhinging, or even in discontinuity. In fact, through both Derrida and quantum physicist and cultural theorist Karen Barad, we might understand this disjoint and disjuncture as not just in time, but inseparably in space and matter. This disjointedness and disjuncture is an effect and trace of what Derrida called hauntology, a deconstructive operation of ontology. That is the question in the study of being. Derrida was particularly interested in the social figuration of time for ontology or being. What's important for us here today is the significance of techne in the shaping, bending, and even constitution of time, and the ways in which time also is about speed. The appearance or perception of the speed of time is a result of techne, technoscience, or teletechnology, including AI, with technologies at different scales shaping the flow of life from macro-level processes, not just nationally but globally, and at the quantum level of the quotidian, the disjoints and disjunctures of time are often showing their face. There are moments when we experience this most palpably, such as through the pandemic, when it seemed as though while time and its function in relation to value under capital continued, the speed of life seemed to slow almost to a halt at points. Technologies such as Zoom enabled the continued mediation of many of our professional transactions and interactions, yet other aspects of life were disrupted and seemingly paused. Even our physical movement was constrained and limited. Yet, what is also important here are the ways in which the pandemic shaped the conditions for what we are now experiencing of an accelerationist agenda. Accelerationism emerges as a machinic desire, compulsion toward the intensification of capital's computational logics and the unbounded proliferation of technological systems. It is not merely an ideology, but a performative orientation toward the recursive expansion of algorithmic governance and neoliberal rationality. Within this frame, automation is not an instrument, but an ontological project, the reconfiguration of the human through machinic abstraction. The accelerationist imaginary disavows the possibility of regulation, deliberation, or democratic intervention, treating disruption and sociopolitical volatility as not only inevitable, but as generative sites of transformation. It is a futurity without breaks, one in which the collapse of the social is not a tragedy, but a catalytic unfolding of the post-human condition. The accelerationist agenda seeks to push the progress and development of capitalism via the dismantling of the state, moving toward what Milton Friedman and other neoliberal and libertarian theorists have long desired of economic freedom as the primary adjudicator of the political. In other words, the desire of the dismantling of all liberal institutions is with the interest of limiting the state to the concerns of the protection of the borders and maintaining the internal affairs of the law. Yet taxes and regulation, libertarians especially, are seen as constraints on progress and development. One might argue it is the transparency thesis or the self-determining subject becoming fully embodied in the market, the liberal subject becoming fully embodied in the market, a market that, as Greek economist Varoufakis has argued, is not really a market, given that competition has been circumscribed in big tech platforms that algorithmically choose for us. I'll say more about this shortly. And of course, the libertarian anarcho-capitalists believe the only way to do this is through authoritarianism. And they expect the populace to become accepting of even desire a dictatorship. The dizzying speed of the accelerationist agenda that we have been experiencing is in stark contrast to 5 years ago and is being felt residually in varying intensities and speeds around the world. Yet, the current accelerationist agenda was further enabled by the slowed, altered, and disrupted conditions of the pandemic. During the pandemic, not only did we have to surrender to the digital mediums for modes of communication, interaction, and work, but the amount of data traffic also increased between 10 to 15% worldwide, according to the World Bank. And this was with relaxed or little regulation. Naomi Klein quoted former Governor Andrew Cuomo in The Guardian rhetorically stating, quote, "The pandemic has created a moment in history when we can actually incorporate and advance Bill Gates's ideas, all these buildings, all these physical classrooms. Why, with all the technology you have?" Additionally, many of the legal advances in ethics and equity in AI that were being made prior to the pandemic were slowed down or even forgotten after the pandemic. Forgotten may not be the right word, but overlooked or erased, opening the pathway for rapid tech development and, as such, the modulation of the speed of life. Even the intensities and speeds experienced seems to vary even within US borders. Many of us comment on how everyday life continues on. Capitalist time struggles along even as it experiences drastic shocks due to tariffs and other economic policy interventions. The public continues the day-to-day routines, while the political turmoil of an authoritarian takeover of government is fastly in process. This also says nothing to the rapidly developing technologies and cognitive machines that are becoming threaded through the quotidian. What Jasbir Puar has called time itself. The speed of life is being affectively modulated through biopolitical technologies to regulate life, capital production, and the discipline and control of bodies through time and space. And these produce disjunctures and disadjustments and disjointedness all the time. What is the desire to autonomize and automatize, create autonomy and automation? Yeah, you can write the words, sometimes you can't read them. What is the desire for both are a process of haunting the possession of what Sylvia Wynter called man in the machine. The media of technology institutes hauntology, and this especially becomes the case for all of those who are the subject of modernity's acts of extraction, dispossession, subjugation, and slow or fast death. Haunting has long been a concept, idea, and trope that has been theorized or engaged throughout cultural theory and literature, including works that have concerned themselves with power and the racial. This is not because of a disavowal of the materialization of the racial, but rather quite the opposite, a nagging question of the metaphysical forces of the materiality of the racial. As Derrida poignantly states, the ghost is not a result of that which is unseen or present, but rather its apparition is a result of an idea or thought that is given presence through another artifactual body. That is, in the appropriative logics of racial capital, the idea or thought becomes subject to the code and automaticity, where the medium of the machine recursively enables its haunting. Literary and media theorist Frederick Kittler reminds us that the ghost never dies, and through the medium of the calculative logics of the machine, the ghost becomes a fantastic apparition. When we take seriously the lie of the post-Enlightenment, and as Ferreira da Silva argues, the ways in which much of the cognitive schemas of modernity are a formation of man or of the subject as pure interiority without exteriority or affectability. This was shaped by racialized hierarchies or authority. The socio-political violence of the artifactual body's inheritance of and possession by cognitive schemas begins to come into view. It is precisely the technopolitical modulating of time, the acceleration of capital, and the biopolitical control that we must not just wrestle with and examine, for there's a lack of urgency and even out of touchness, if you will, of what's at stake in this. That is to say, what is at stake in just stopping to examine. But more directly, we need to identify the main protocols of power and develop strategies for halting them, rupturing them, and breaking them. For it is through the disruption of the current authoritarian regime's accelerationist agenda that we can also begin to do the freedom dreaming work that we all imagine. What we are seeing today, Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis has called techno-feudalism, is characterized by the emergence of a new ruling class owning cloud capital, or what he calls cloudalist, which forecloses the decentralized form of a market as a site of buyers and sellers that met freely and spontaneously. Instead, trading is centralized in the cloud, belonging to big tech platforms whose algorithmic designs match buyers and sellers. Cloud capital is said to function through three types of algorithmic behavior modification. The first strand is defined by the way consumers are commanded to become cloud serfs as they reproduce cloud capital. The second strand transforms wage labor into cloud proles who work harder and are more precarious. The final strand demarcates how cloud capital ends the market as much as a new techno-corporate oligarchy owns the platform space it rents to the cloud proles. Techno-feudalism replaces markets with cloud fiefs. It is through this third strand that the cloudalists are granted a new form of extractive power for surplus value produced from the cloud proles, the traditional means of capital. What is remarkable here, according to Varoufakis, is that the capitalist sector itself has been dependent on cloud capital, which has added another dimension to modes of extraction. This entails not only the unpaid labor of cloud serfs, the prosumers of digital goods, but also the cloud rent that so-called vassal capitalists have to pay to platform corporations in order to sell their products, such as Amazon, Apple, Meta, Uber, Airbnb. For Varoufakis, to rent and not to own cloud space is the primary function of accumulation and extraction of value. Rent gives the illusion that we can all be entrepreneurs or capitalists by producing a product that we can sell in the digital marketplace. However, while we think we will own the surplus profit of the product, our participation fee in the market, between 30 to 40%, requires the foregoing of a significant slice of capital. The renting of the cloud space is thus key to the participation in the market. Renting as a form of accumulation points to an intensified economic structure of a dependence or debt between the producer and the cloud owner. The control of the surplus profit in the hands of the owner of the cloud space creates a mode of dependency of the wannabe entrepreneur or capitalist. These forms of cloud renting expand capital accumulation and generate increasingly larger capacities of surplus value for the owner. Interestingly, the point that I think, Warner, I think you had mentioned about in Pennsylvania, the training of entrepreneurs, it's as though they're literally linking into this very reshaped market, or if it's even a market, to what extent. Since this form of digital abstraction seems to make market relations redundant because it algorithmically assigns buyers to sellers and labor to capitalists, so-called techno-feudalism also enables a computationally driven intensification of segregation, which constitutes the social, racial, and gender order of techno-feudalism itself. As algorithmic matching seems to follow the rule of homophily to cluster the same modes of consumption, desires, and exploitation, it also continues to reify existing rules of social order without subjectivation, without subject formation. Techno-feudalism captures the symptoms of a new order of capital extraction in the formation of nation states and city-states that have increasingly moved toward the creation of tax-free, unregulated zones of commerce. Examples of these might be Hong Kong, as well as particular parts of London post-Brexit. Labor value is not extracted through wages, but pushed out of the labor market through gaming and wagers that give us the illusion of stepping above the ordinary equality of working 24/7. The emergence of unwaged labor, however, is not a new way to replace the market with a free labor force. The free, creative, cognitive, affective, social, human value labor. Instead, there remains here an irreversible precedent in the logic of capital coinciding with the necessity of unwaged enslaved labor at the incipient form of the pre-industrial form of extraction. Techno-feudalism, in other words, seems to circumvent the principle of accumulation, related not to the class formation of the proletariat, but to the economy of the slave trade that initiated a form of free labor whereby the enslaved and captive African was re-engineered as the native labor of the New World economy of the plantation. According to Sylvia Winter, this was not simply an economic necessity for the cumulative phase of capital, but was a cultural necessity that required the cosmogonic transformation of the African captive into a New World native through a process of indigenization that was carried through the plantation economy. What might be characterized as a libertarian anarcho-capitalism, the accelerationism of techno-feudalism also entails a dismantling of liberalism. This includes a disregard and disavowal of the values and principles of liberal political thought and an attack on the liberal institutions of democracy and higher education, as each are associated with not only the primary importance of the political, but also the specific values of ethics, equity, and justice. The formation of these principles as we understand them today go back to the Enlightenment and political philosophers such as John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant, among others. For libertarians and accelerationists, this is not only counter to what they believe is needed, they posit that the political will always constrain the possibilities for economic progress and development. This is a page directly from Milton Friedman, as it has been noted that Patrick Friedman, his grandson who holds similar perspectives to his grandfather, has been an influence in the same circles of Peter Thiel and others of the Silicon Valley elite. Where for libertarians and accelerationists, democracy constrains economic freedom. Science and the pursuit of ideas of intellectualism are impediments to technological progress and development. That is to say, the parallel of what democracy does to economic freedom is the parallel of what would be understood of what science and the pursuit of ideas of intellectualism does to technological progress and development. The liberal ideals and values of ethics, equity, and justice are associated with the institutions of higher education and its scientific and intellectual pursuit of knowledge. In this vastly reshaping political, economic, and ideological context, we must ask the question, what will become of ethics, equity, and justice in AI? How will the concerns and pursuits for ethics, equity, and justice in AI under the discourse of anti-DEI and anti-DEIA, as well as the dismantling of the liberal political institutions of democracy and civil society, become reshaped? Given what I discussed earlier of the dominant logic of representation in the existing FATE discourse, how will ethics, equity, and justice in AI become reconstituted? In the field of AI and education, we have to be particularly vigilant of this, as it is one of the main processes and institutions of society that does the work of cultivating the citizenry. As Hannah Arendt cogently argued, a new political order can be shaped, not through force and constraint, nor through persuasion, but through the social process and arrangement of education. This can be greatest accomplished through the hidden logics and protocols of AI educational technologies. This instrumentalizing of reason is threaded throughout the field of education, especially in AI-engineered platforms and technologies. These AI educational technologies are often in the service of supporting or enabling the learning and development of the student, and even temporarily supplant the role of the teacher or parent. These forms of human surrogacy, where the role and responsibility of the human is being replaced by a machine, are at the foundation of learning and artificial intelligence, including the development of robots. In reference to the use of robots in place of human labor, Kalindi Vora and Neda Atanasowski argue, quote, "The claim that technologies can act as surrogates capitulates histories of disappearance, erasure, and elimination necessary to maintain the liberal subject as the agent of historical progress. When surrogate technologies turn to the pedagogical process of education and parenting, it becomes what I call surrogate pedagogy, an instrumentalizing of the transparent or normalized or universalized subject in place of the teacher or parent mediating everyday processes of learning and development. This is not simply an effort at momentary intervention, but through the instrumentalizing of the interiority of human reason, also does the generative work of racialization by shaping the child in the mold of the ways of being and knowing of the universalized subject, violently erasing and subjecting the student to the machine's overdetermination, We find this in the proliferation of learning analytics platforms, employing AI both within and out of school, AI-engineered video games for education, and AI robots for children. The process of learning becomes a socio-technical assemblage, whereby learning is an accomplishment of the becoming interactions between human and machine. Yet, this socio-technical assemblage remains haunted by the disciplining and desires of the protocological formations of the machine itself. I want to be clear that all of us that have been and are doing work on ethics, equity, and justice in AI somehow forget that in AI somehow forget these concerns. The scholarly discourse that we do not somehow forget these concerns. Sorry, the scholarly discourse is somehow completely foreclosed, or that we will cease to do work on these questions. In fact, it is here where I do turn to an interest for promise and even hope, where I do turn to AI for promise and even hope. As is known in policy research, the most effective ways of transforming policy is not only at the federal level, it is on the local level, and especially through connections and relationships with intermediary policymakers. In other words, change happens most effectively from the bottom up. What I have shared here today are notes on a rapidly changing system, one based on the interest in an unbridled economy and techno-capitalist sector operationalized by AI. Yet we know AI is not one entity or machine as is depicted in Westworld, but rather a network of systems recursively feeding back on themselves that are developed and applied in myriad contexts and practices and systems. Where discourse has long been the site of contestation for the political, AI and computational cultures has increasingly become the space and practice for contestation. Although regulation through the law and policy may be increasingly in question and decline, that does not preclude or prevent research and development of AI that maintains the focus and values of ethics, equity, and justice. In fact, this work will become significantly more needed and important. That said, more research is needed on AI in education generally. Unfortunately, not only is there far less known in education research on AI, the technology is also rapidly advancing, thus making it difficult to keep up with the necessary produced evidence and knowledge formation that would help inform what can be done. There's more research on the software and its various applications than there is on the technosocial system of various AI applications and how they are shaping pedagogical transactions and experiences, let alone questions on ethics and equity. Many of the developments are coming from venture capitalist educational technology corporations, and often the extent of research on their product is limited to the internal beta testing the company has done. They have not been independently evaluated, and rarely are questions of ethics and equity seriously examined or considered. Thus, more research is needed of the software and of the human-computer interaction with AI educational technologies. Related to the lack of research, what is also needed are standards and guidelines for the adoption or procurement of educational technology platforms. Currently, there is no regulation, no standards, and no guidelines to help inform decision-making processes for adopting educational technologies. The International Society for Technology and Education does provide helpful information that many educators use, but even ISTE themselves will say that what they have is limited. Like the standards for educational and psychological testing, there is the need for the development of similar standards for AI educational technologies that would at least place some agreed upon understanding of what's ethically expected and necessitated of all educational technologies. Additionally, guidelines are also needed to help inform educators on their decisions of what to consider when adopting educational technologies. And I do want to point out, the standards do not need, in fact, are not even tied to federal policy or even state policy for that matter. They're developed by professional organizations. In closing, I will leave us with this question. If the use of identity markers are understood to be discriminatory, then how do we ensure AI does not become a system of harm, oppression, disparate impact, or asymmetrically experienced material effects and consequences? or the backdooring of subjugation, dispossession, and the overrepresentation of the human. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Shayan Doroudi. Shayan is an assistant professor in the UC Irvine School of Education, where he's been on the faculty since 2019. His formal background is in computer science, but he now thinks and writes about what he calls the foundations of learning about learning. Here, foundations means the philosophical, historical, sociological, ethical, and critical perspectives that underlie our field. The idea is that he examines how those foundations relate to the design of socio-technical systems that improve learning. Like Ezekiel, he is not new to this area. He's been writing about issues of equity in AI throughout his career.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you for to the organizers for inviting me to be here. This is a wonderful symposium, and it's an honor to be here today. So there's, I'm thinking about what to talk about. There's a lot of issues, as Ezekiel has pointed out, a lot of negative ramifications of these technologies. What I want to do here is a little bit different and maybe uplifting, I'm not sure, but to talk about some justice-oriented visions of AI in education. What would it look like for AI and education to be aligned with our ethical values, with justice, with equity and fairness? And to do this, I want to give a couple, maybe 2.5 case studies from the history of AI in education to look at some historical examples, different approaches, very different from the AI we see today, and also very different from the education we most, maybe not in this group, but we see by and large in the United States and in the world today. And maybe these are more provocations, and we can see, to what extent they're realistic in the current moment or in the future. So for our first case study, I'm going to look at microworlds, and it's an app that we already had an introduction. Uri Walensky presented a biography of Seymour Papert, so I don't have to do that, which is good because I only have 15 minutes. So I'm going to focus on one particular idea in Papert's writings, which is that of microworlds. Papert and his colleagues, I should say. And we already heard like a brief notion of microworlds, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually give 4 different ways in which Papert uses the term microworlds, 4 different definitions or different ideas. 3 of which I think are explicitly in his writings, another one that is my own interpretation of some of his writings. In fact, all of these are interpretations. As you'll see, he never gives definitions of microworlds in many terms because we're supposed to construct it for ourselves. So this is my construction of his four notions of microworlds in his writings. And it's mostly going to have a historical progression. So the first we see is the notion of microworlds in his work in artificial intelligence. So this goes back to the work of Minsky and Papert and their students. And one particular example of this is this blocks world here that you see here. Several students at the MIT AI lab worked on Block's world. I think the most notable work was from Terry Winograd on SHRDLU, which I think is where this image is coming from. And you don't have to really know much about this world. The idea is that it's a small, self-contained world with a bunch of blocks that have colors. Unfortunately, they didn't have colors, so instead it says red here. You can't read it probably, but it says red. So take it that this is a red block. And you see that you can say, pick up a big red block. The AI says, okay, and it picks up the big red block. You can say, move into the box. You can ask questions, which block is behind the tallest pyramid, and it can answer those questions. So it can both describe the world and it can change the world. But of course, it doesn't, it's a pretty small world. It doesn't really represent our world, but that's partially the point. So if you look at how Minsky and Papert wrote about microworlds, and this is, I think, the first, one of the earliest writings where the term microworld was used, they say we are dependent on having simple but highly developed models of many phenomena. Each model, or microworld, as we shall call it, is very schematic, a fairyland in which things are so simplified that almost every statement about them would be literally false if asserted about the real world. So they're recognizing the limitations that these microworlds, like the blocks world, are not accurate renditions of the real world. But then they go on to say that nevertheless, we feel they are so important that we plan to assign a large portion of our effort to developing a collection of these microworlds and finding how to embed their suggestive and predictive powers in larger systems without being misled by their incompatibility with literal truth. We see this problem of using schematic heuristic knowledge as a central problem in artificial intelligence. So again, they're acknowledging the limitations, and they're saying, okay, if we have multiple of these microworlds, the idea is maybe you can design AI that can engage in different microworlds, start to transfer, from one microworld to another, start to overcome the limitations of the individual microworlds. So unlike, current AI, where we see that they're also not compatible with literal truth, but unfortunately that's causing a lot of, chaos because I think a lot of people don't always know when they're not. I think here the vision was we're intentionally designing these systems that are, often, simplified, oversimplified, false, but perhaps by combining them, we can come up with a more sophisticated world. And this will become more clear as we go to the next definition, where Papert starts to apply these ideas, and perhaps this was in his mind when they were writing about in the AI context, but around a decade later, they start to actually apply these ideas to human learning, how people learn. And the idea here, and this is not the concept of microworlds that's most familiar to perhaps many of you, here we're actually talking about microworlds in the human mind. So just like the AI is working within a microworld, as people, Papert is presuming here that we also operate in microworlds. And this, I think, we can say this is related to Piaget's ideas of action schemes or schemas, at least that's my interpretation, that we develop these schemes for making sense of the world, and they're not always completely accurate, they're not always true, we have to revise these schemes, we have to combine these schemes. And so the way he writes about it here is that there are limits for each of these slices of reality, just like we saw in the AI context. And I'm going to suggest that in a very general way, not only in the computer context, but probably in all important learning, an essential and central mechanism is to confine yourself to a little piece of reality that is simple enough to understand. It's by looking at little slices of reality at a time that you learn to understand the greater complexities of the whole world, the macro world. I don't know about you, but I just find this quote really beautiful. So whether or not it's true, you can think about it. So this then takes us to the notion of microworld that's most familiar with the people are most familiar with, which is microworlds in educational technology. The most prominent in Papert's writings being Logo. Of course, we have NetLogo and Scratch. I don't know if Scratch is called a microworld, but a lot of these technologies that are based off of Logo or inspired by Logo are microworlds. And of course, there's many outside of even Legos and lots of. As we'll see, lots of concepts could be seen as microworlds. And the idea here is that by working with a microworld, whether it's something physical or digital, we can then construct these microworlds that we were talking about earlier in our head. By working with this small world outside of our heads, we can construct microworlds for making sense of the macro world in our heads. So here's one quote. I think in the interest of time, I won't read all of this, but as you can see, here, Papert's describing what a microworld would be like. You can try all sorts of things. You will never get into trouble. You will never feel stupid. It will never say a rude thing to you. And then he goes on to say, and yet while being safe, it is also designed to be discovery-rich in the sense that little nuggets of knowledge have been scattered around in it for you to find. Right? So in these microworlds, by interacting with these microworlds, whether Logo or any other microworld, we can start to discover these pieces of knowledge, maybe discover some powerful ideas that we can use to facilitate the construction of microworlds in our head. Now, the important thing I want to make, go back to here is that there's this through line, even though it's not very apparent and it's hard to make sense of if you're just reading some of Papert's writings, there's a through line from that concept of microworld in the AI, in the work in AI, all the way to here into psychology and to educational technology. Now I'd like to give a fourth notion of microworld that builds on this third one, which is the least explicit, I think, in Papert's writings, but I think it is implicitly there, and I hope that those of you who knew Papert would agree. And this is what I'm calling microworlds for social justice. This is not a quote, but it's a play on the quote that I read earlier. It's by transforming little slices of reality at a time that you learn to transform the whole world, the macro world. And I think one way of understanding this notion of microworld is going back to Papert's activism. So as Uri mentioned, he was actually an anti-apartheid activist in his youthful days as a teenager in South Africa. He was actually, I think, prohibited from leaving the country. Somehow he left the country, I'm not sure how. But yeah, he was very much an activist and got into trouble for that. And I think that carried through his line of work, from my understanding. And many of his colleagues, many of his students also had that activism. We'll see one example in a moment. And this is, at least implicitly, if not explicitly present, not necessarily in discussions of microworlds, but in other contexts, where environments like microworlds can facilitate this kind of transformation of the world, right? Into creating more equitable, more just visions of the world. And so we can see several layers of this transformation. First of all, Microworlds can transform how a child learns. Papert talked about this extensively, that we can actually maybe alter Piaget's stages of cognitive development through microworlds. It can transform the educational system, and I think that's something Papert wanted to see, right? That we're getting, we're changing schools as we see it, creating these microworlds where students can truly learn as they do best. I mean, potentially could transform. It hasn't transformed the education system, but potentially it has that potential for transformation. And also, perhaps most clearly related to my point, it can transform the social setting. And I think this argument is made perhaps most compellingly by one of Papert's former students, Alan Shaw, who came up with the notion of social constructionism. And the way he defines social constructionism, again, not defined in like a dictionary definition, but first he goes and discusses the sociocultural and constructivist viewpoints that underpin constructionism. And he says that social constructionism adds further harmony to sociocultural and constructivist views by revealing that the social setting is also enhanced by the developmental activity of the individual. That is, by constructing knowledge in a social setting, we can actually enhance that social setting. And Shaw actually developed this platform for what he called urban renewal. So it was basically a microworld representing a neighborhood. So it's actually literally kind of a micro version of a neighborhood where people can interact online to actually coordinate efforts and actually do work, justice-oriented work in their neighborhood. Okay. And then just of time, I'm going to quickly move on to the second case study, which is Heinz von Forster's work. So Heinz von Forster was a cybernetician. Cybernetics is this AI-adjacent discipline that's not regarded as AI. It's not sanctioned AI, but I think it's close enough that we can call it AI. He was also a learning scientist, but before learning sciences existed, in my words. So we can say his work was in AI and the learning sciences in some sense. So in 1968, von Forster and Herbert Brun taught a course not too far from here at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. They taught a course called Heuristics. They described this course as having three goals. One was to help students learn how to think, solve problems, and learn. Basically, it's a course on thinking about thinking and learning, very akin to Papert's idea. Second, it was to use research on cognition and learning, research that they were doing in their lab, the Biological Computation Laboratory, to actually figure out how to actually design this learning environment. And third, to use the classroom as an extension of the research laboratory to improve our understanding of cognition and learning. So it's basically a course about thinking and learning, using, we could say, learning sciences to design the course, and also treating it as a lab to improve the learning sciences. So it should be a course that learning scientists would very much like, of course, 2 decades before the learning sciences existed. And this course also led to publications that came out of it, publications that were co-authored by all the students in the course. The first one was the whole university catalog. And later versions of the course led to this publication called Cybernetics of Cybernetics, which is, I think, one of von Forster's most famous volumes, but it was co-authored with his students and colleagues. Now, what he didn't mention, so this report was written because they got in trouble with the university, they got in trouble with the governor of Illinois, I think, because this course was controversial, to say the least. So this whole university catalog, if you actually open it, it's talking about things like drugs, like campus riots, like all the problems with the university. But he's saying, no, it's just a course about how to learn. The thing is, students have to learn how to deal with the social problems of the world. And so in some sense, it was a micro-world for understanding, for how students understood their university and how they chose to push back against it. You could say we're seeing similar kinds of micro-worlds across campuses today. Of course, I'm not saying I agree with everything in this, all the things the students came up with. As Papert said, micro-worlds have false, statements or, things that are always true, but it's making sense of the world and trying to change the world, and taking these steps towards that. Von Forster then, a few years later, was invited by Ivan Illich in 1971 to go to his institute, SciDoc, in Cuernavaca, Mexico. I don't have time to go into Illich's work if you're not familiar. Very fascinating. I wanted to find a picture of his institute, and I happened to find this picture, which is fitting for two reasons. One is that it was taken, and a lot of pictures that I found online were taken by an undergraduate from Northwestern. The second reason is because it happened, wasn't expecting this, actually happens to have von Forster and Illich leading a seminar together. This might have been, it was in the same year, it might have been from this seminar in 1971 called Interpersonal Relational Networks. So this was a seminar where Illich basically invited some of the leading cyberneticians of that time to come to talk about networks. how networks work and how networks can help us understand interpersonal relations, basically how networks operate in society. And as part of this, Illich gave a talk, which later that year, I think, became a chapter in his famous book, Deschooling Society. A famous chapter called Learning Webs, where he described networks that could basically change how we see education. One version of this was called Education Without Schools, right? How we can change society to have education through networks where people identify who's interested in the same topics, and they can get together, discuss, learn from each other. They can be connected with materials in their environment to construct knowledge together, etc. And it's interesting that Illich saw cybernetics, which again is kind of like AI, but not exactly, as relevant to this process. Interestingly, here at Northwestern, there was actually a version of Illich's idea implemented in the 1970s called the Learning Exchange. And this was basically a place, and this is Von Forster's pamphlet, you can see here. This was actually a way for people to get together, to have meetups, to talk about whatever topics they're interested in. Here's just some of the topics you can see, quite broad of a range. T is people who are willing to teach, L is people who are willing to learn. Unfortunately, it wasn't always a match. That might be one reason it was, we don't still have the Learning Exchange here at Northwestern. Another reason might be they weren't using computers, they were using flashcards and phone calls to get together to connect people. So you could re-implement that if you want. So let's, to wrap up, I think there's a reason we're seeing some parallels between Pappert's visions in AI, in education, and social justice, and Von Forster's visions in cybernetics, in his version, early version of the learning sciences, and in his activism. I think one reason is, or one connection, is that they were both close colleagues of Warren McCulloch. Now, Warren McCulloch was also a cybernetician, most famous, most known for his paper in 1943, which introduced the neural network as a model of computation. And the same neural network is, obviously going through many iterations and changing drastically, is what underpins the current rise of transformers, ChatGPT, and all these things. So this is sort of the earliest work in that line of work. But what's less known is that 2 years later, McCulloch actually wrote this paper, A Hierarchy of Values Determined by the Topology of Nervous Nets. Now, this paper, I think, if nothing else, it's quite interesting because he talks about how a 6-node neural network, shown here, could actually have what's called a hierarchy of values. And the reason is there's this loop, there's a cycle in this neural network. And this hierarchy of values, really quickly, it just means that you can prefer A to B, you can prefer B to C, but then you can prefer C to A. So there's what could be conceived of as a logical paradox being introduced by a very simple neural network. Now, this notion of hierarchy, which was popularized through this paper, comes up a lot in Pappert's writings, both the writings in AI and his writings in education. I'll just flash this quote, I won't read it out, where he's actually connecting hierarchy, politics, and education. It also comes up in Von Forster's writings. They're both really inspired by this idea. Hierarchy as a challenge to hierarchy. And so we can see that they had visions of AI, visions of education, visions of social justice and politics that oppose the some aspects of hierarchy. And these kinds of hierarchy we're seeing in present day's AI, not only in the way that these neural networks work, but also in the way the corporations building these AIs operate. And I think it's interesting, maybe just symbolic, that the transformer architecture is a feed-forward neural network architecture. It has no loops. So it's impossible to have a hierarchy in it. And maybe that's just a symbolic point, but I think, maybe we should go back to the day when 6-node neural networks brought, provocative discussions that can help us think about AI, education, and politics differently. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. So Sefer Vakil, our third speaker, who he's not here, but he has helpfully sent in his a list of challenging questions. And I think we'll start with a few of those. So let me read first. Sefer says, I'll quickly introduce myself by saying I'm an associate professor in the LS program in CESP. My research, in very, very broad strokes, is preoccupied with the ethics and politics of STEM education, learning, and identity in various contexts. I'm going to go to his first question, which I've edited all. There's quite a lot of text here. I've edited all for brevity. So question number one. This is territory you've been over, but I think it helps to maybe pose the question in Sepper's voice. He says, "First, I would set the stage in a few ways. We know that while AI research and innovation has its origins in universities and within academic disciplines, including the learning sciences, much scientific achievement in artificial intelligence and machine learning now resides within the tech industry. And to state the obvious, the tech industry, while not monolithic, is certainly not a neutral player. They've never been, but it is now advanced to new levels, with many of the leaders of the industry aligning themselves with the current administration in very explicit ways. It's also important to note that many of the efforts of the Biden-Harris administration on AI safety, fairness, and regulation are being aggressively rolled back. At the same time, the current administration is also very clear on the importance of AI in education." And here's his question. "What values and principles should guide the field of AI and learning sciences in the next decade, given this tough political context?" You can have a moment to think. Sure. He says, "What values and principles should guide the field of AI and learning sciences in the next decade, given this political context?"
Can you hear me? Okay, there we go. Of course, Sapir is going to give us the big question. Actually, I don't know if I have a salient and just incoherent response to this. I mean, I might just offer a couple of things here that to help get even some response started, if you will, or engagement around the question. So, as I was even speaking to in my talk, I think one of the things we have to take seriously is that as we engage in various practices and approaches to trying to make AI more equitable and ethical, that the very notion and focus on representation is always going to be limited. That is to say, in as much as we continue to think about how to make sure certain identities are represented, this is always going to be, and I want to be clear, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient, is what I'm trying to say. And the ways in which it's not sufficient is that it does not, in fact, change the epistemology of the system. And my main contention is, how do we go about addressing the ways in which the machine itself, or AI itself, the technology itself, is processing the multiple ways of being and knowing? What we see and come across time and time again is the ways in which AI and its various iterations and its applications and developments does the kind of, and I'm currently thinking of a learning analytics platform that provides revision feedback, but kind of chiseling away to a particular mold of a way and style and approach of writing. And that is, in fact, directly tied to standards of assessment, state standards of assessment. Not only is this does this become a way of universalizing writing, but it also becomes a way of actually violently disciplining out all the creativity, all the various ways of going about expression. It also just has a way of being counter to the very notion of revision, reimagining, recreating, right? Opening up, re-seeing, seeing anew. And so it's a long way of, I guess, of saying, I think we have to really take seriously in going into the machine to think about the design of the very processing of information, how to open it up to the multiplicity of ways of being and knowing. And I'm saying this also, and I did respond to this directly, but maybe I'll make this explicit. We have to do it. If what is happening in the level of the political is going to happen. It's going to take its course. We need to fight. We need to resist at every turn. However, it's us that is going to have to do the work to transform the technologies and how they are being used for the concerns and interests of ethics, equity, and justice. So while we may not get the regulations that we might truly believe are needed, we can't wait for it. There's too much urgency that's at stake.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think, I think building off of that, I think one possibility is to, in conjunction with my talk, to conceive of other ways of constructing AI. Obviously, that then goes to AI research. Not all of us are capable of doing that. But another way of looking at it as well is, given the technologies that are there, how do we make the best of them, and how do we align them with the visions that we want to see, what we want to see from education? And I think we've already seen some great examples of this, of how do we use large language models, despite their problems and their limitations. How do we think about using them in ways that are productive and not counterproductive? So I think in Mitch Resnick's talk with Scratch, what the things Scratch are doing, or many of the other talks, thinking about that. And maybe, thinking about them as a micro world, right? They have limitations. If we can acknowledge that, and in fact, leverage that, rather than say, oh, let's think about this as an answer to all our problems and use it to do whatever we want, that's not going to work, right? Now, having said that, I think learning scientists are great at coming up with these like really interesting ideas and that are fascinating and that we all, can think are really cool. But how many of those are like the things that kids are using in schools? Versus how many kids are actually going to use ChatGPT to write their essays or do all sorts of other things that we don't want them to do. So I think we also need to think about, what do we do about the status quo and what people are doing? And I don't think regulations are going to solve that anyway. So I think it's true. I think maybe there's concerns about, in the current political climate, getting regulations passed. But I don't know how much. Maybe I'm cynical. I don't know how much that would actually do. Right? Are regulations going to stop students from using AI in problematic ways? No. I mean, there are already regulations in our universities. Do those stop students from using, or in high schools? No. And so I think we need to think about that. And I think one, maybe this is related to a later question, but one question, related to ethics is like things about integrity, not just the regulation, like, okay, well, how do we change our academic integrity policies? How do we build a culture where students have integrity? And how do we think about that as learning scientists? I don't know the answer, but I think getting together and discussing these things is important, right? So, having these grassroots initiatives to discuss these questions, like the symposium, to think about what do we want, what do we want the world to be like, and then how do we actually disseminate that and get other people to be on board with that.
The floor is open for other people to come up and get online to ask questions if you like. I'll instead interject one of Sepper's additional questions. So he says, something that I've noticed is the formation of ideological camps within the learning sciences community. There's some who are squarely in the reject and resist AI camp, and others who can't contain their enthusiasm for AI and what it could offer the field of LS and education broadly. So here's his question. How do we prevent the formation of ideological camps from stifling important scientific progress in this space and from effectively impacting the public narrative around AI and education? In other words, how do we prevent internal ideological rifts in LS from limiting our impact and the future of really great science at intersections of AI and learning?
So I'm not in the learning science field, so I'm less familiar with the particular fields, but or particular camps, I should say. But these camps exist in other fields as well. And one of the things that I'm will use myself as a way of thinking through this question. I mean, I come through a training in formal psychometrics where you have similar kind of camps, but also critical theory, for instance, is just completely eschewed. It's not even within the discourse for that matter. On the flip side, critical theory completely is critical of positivism and even statistics or even technology for that matter. So you have these two particular fields that are separate of one another that are seemingly incommensurable. Part of what I've tried to do in my own scholarship is to find ways of thinking across them. Where are the ways, what are the seeming irreducible differences? What are the ways in which they're actually there are overlaps? What are ways in which there are assumptions that are being made between one another that actually can fall right apart the minute you begin to push them and question them? So in some ways, I might even say, what is it behind the resistance to that actually can speak to the embrace, the enthusiasm of it, and vice versa, right? Is there a way in which the suspicions that exist in the camps of those that are resisting to technology, or AI for that matter, are there ways in which their very suspicions could help enable a very and deeply productive discourse and conversation toward what might be a whole nother way of approaching and thinking about and building even a frame for technology or AI itself within learning science? That may not be articulated clearly enough, but what I'm trying to get at is oftentimes the assumptions that are made between camps are not static, or they're not fixed, or they're resting on faulty ideas. And if we can get each camp in the room to engage in a productive conversation and get past the siloed understandings, especially even the language, using the same term that might have different meanings or nuances, if we can get past that, there's a way in which you can actually get to something new, something different, even beyond the two camps themselves.
Again, I think that was a great answer, and maybe it's I want to articulate sort of what you said in just a different term, is to engage in like a dialectical process, and I think that's exactly what you're talking about, right? That it's a dialectic. You have two extremes, and to have this back and forth. And I think I do this individually, and so on any given day I might be like, should I be doing research on large language models? On another day I might be like, I'm just thinking about all the research and cool things we do, for example, right? So engaging in this process, and I think, it's wonderful to see, like, I think, I love to read papers from, or articles from critics, right? From critics of AI. And I think, I think maybe I'm also partially a critic myself. So I'd love to see some of the enthusiasts doing that, right? And I think that's the problem. Sometimes they don't, and vice versa. And I think, sometimes, the vice versa might be hard, but actually that's probably easier. I don't know, but to see examples of like compelling things people are doing with generative AI, and it's like, or interesting things, is worthwhile. And I read that in a review, like it was like a book review, and I think it was Critical AI, I think is the journal, or and it was a dual book review. One was Ethan Mollick's book, Co-Intelligence, which is, as an enthusiast of the technology. And another one was, if I remember correctly, it was the book AI Snake Oil. So a critical book. And it was interesting. I was like, oh, I wonder what this, and it was in a critical AI journal. So you might imagine which way it would go. But the book review did a really nice job of actually talking about, well, there's actually some points of overlap between these, and there's some interesting. So I would recommend that as one example of how to engage in this dialectic, in this dialogue. Like, you can acknowledge, valid points and also, problems, right, from these different perspectives. But you have to engage in that dialogue. You have to know the language, and you have to to some extent maybe immerse yourself in it to even to criticize it better.
Yeah. So a theme, the point coming in that actually spins off of Shayan's talking about microworlds, and also what was going on in AI at the time that Papert was working on microworlds in AI and in education, was the notion that the enterprise at that point was to make things explicit and transparent, which is totally different than the machine learning world that was working on saying, can we just look at the data and get something that works by running statistics in various ways over the data? And when you get something that does what it does, and no one knows, including the people who build it, exactly how it achieves what it achieves. And I think that's this notion of making things clear and explicit and transparent that can then be shared with students, shared with auditors, shared with observers. I think that gets to the issues of what it was we need to do and need to make everything move back towards if we want to have, it's the same as, take the authoritarian, you are not allowed to say how the tariffs are going to raise prices on your goods. Every time, the authoritarian is always making things less transparent. And the original scientific endeavor in AI was to make things very transparent. And that was a thought, put a question mark on it.
Yeah, it's a good thought. I mean, I think Papert actually explicitly used the term glass box, right? Which we don't hear much of today, maybe because we don't have glass box AI. So what would it be like? I mean, there's efforts like in the fate community, transparency is one of their issues, but it's post hoc transparency. How do we make these models more transparent? That can help maybe, but I think you pointed to issues like these post hoc kinds of ways of looking at this, like take a broken model and then try to patch it up and then say, oh, now it's perfect. I don't think that works, but maybe it could still help to some extent. But I agree. Maybe thinking about how do we design with transparency at the forefront, and what does that look like? Or even, I mean, we can also take inspiration from I think Minsky and Papert's work on perceptrons. They were taking actually a very simple version of a neural network, but even then, one that we didn't really understand what it was doing, and they mathematically analyzed it like in a very sophisticated way. And that work is now treated as like, oh, they killed work on neural networks, that was bad. That's actually not, if you actually look at it, there was a very sophisticated mathematical analysis, and they're saying we need to do more of this kind of thing to understand what these technologies are and what they're doing. But I think, yeah. So I don't know how to do more of this, but I think it's a great point.
I'll keep my response short. So great comment. I appreciate the question in the comment. And two things. One is I while I was at Penn several years ago, I brought some researchers from the Data Science for Good group at IBM to come join us, spend some time with us, give a talk, especially given we had our data analytics and social policy program. And one of the things that they mentioned was that the importance that in fact they, how did I put it? Anyways, the importance of using white box algorithms in high stakes context and decision making, right? So especially context of predictive policing, for example, they would say there absolutely should not be a black box algorithm being used in this context. It should be a white box algorithm, even if we are using, if there is a predictive policing, right? This was an important point that I thought, and that I think at least gets us something of, when it comes to making decisions on people's lives, at least we can come back to and have a sense of what is going on. How did it even get here? Here's the last thing I want to mention. Black box algorithms, you can't see. We don't know what's going on. It's obscure. White box algorithms are transparent. We're able to see. We are able to see what's going on. There's a racial logic to this, directly mapped right onto it. And I'm calling this out just to say, like, I think there's a way in which I'm using the language intentionally to refer to the ways in which it is deeply in much of the language and discourse even of computer science and all. Yeah, I'll stop on that. Thank you.
Yes.
Go for it.
Yeah. Hello, Melissa Chen, Northwestern University. So I'm here, I guess, to ask a question on behalf of myself, but also others who are like me, so PhD students working, for me, myself at least, in design at the intersection of computer science and learning sciences. And I found both of your talks really compelling, and I'm curious to hear what your concrete advice is for academics, and especially young academics, PhD students, early career folks, in enacting the changes that you're advocating for, and especially for like resisting accelerationism, which can be difficult to do, especially as a young academic. Thank you.
It's a great question and a big question. I want to first start with, we don't know what the academy is going to be like tomorrow. So it's hard to even begin to give advice for an academic career versus just pursuing the career that you want and desire. And that might be in the academy, it might be outside the academy. And there's something to the very movement of shrinking the academic institutions, shrinking the pursuit of science, even the funding for it, and even this call for trying to place research within the private sector. That on the one hand, I want to critique all day. The Institute for Advanced Study comes about because of this idea of the value and importance of curiosity, unencumbered curiosity-driven scholarship, the importance and value of it. John von Neumann brings about the development of the first computer because of his time at the Institute for Advanced Study. This is actually a value, and that is deeply part of the academy. But I do wonder if this also might be a time to pivot and reimagine the pursuit of science and even intellectual ideas in other ways. And I'm just going to put a period on that for all of us to imagine what that might be. And then the second thing is, we have to figure out, where are the spokes? Where are the protocols? Where are the points of fissure? We need pilots, or excuse me, not we. They need pilots to fly the planes to El Salvador. Those pilots are making a decision to fly those planes, despite the order. And despite, in fact, they might be doing something against the law. I'm just using them as an example. There are a number of other examples where you have actors and processes that are at play that are questionably unconstitutional and against the law that could be levers to push and work. These are some of the spokes that I think need to be worked and ruptured. Put a stick in that wheel, if you will.
It's kind of hard to follow up, but I think I think maybe in contrast to an institutional kind of way of looking at it, as an individual, I mean, maybe I'll just give a pragmatic answer. So many people are working on large language models now, and there's a lot of there's a lot of people doing similar things. So you maybe want to find something different, right? So to differentiate yourself, and this is just from a pragmatic perspective. So figure out what that is, and then if you can align it with some vision that you really agree with. Personally, I take inspiration from history, so read about the history of the field because a lot of people don't. So you can learn from that as well, and you might find a direction that other people aren't considering that challenges the status quo in some way that other people aren't trying to do.
Two speakers.